Hello everybody. Today we want to present you our topic fantasy books. We sort of created a different presentation as usual, so we're not going to tell you how fantasy books are structured, but we're going to work with a specific statement. Many people who dislike fantasy books and don't read them state that they are all the same, all primitive, shallow, and without any relevance for reality. So what we are going to do now is simply to disprove this.
First, we're going to focus on the first part, the claim that they are all the same. I'll present you some novels, name their best advantages and disadvantages, and hopefully you'll be convinced by the end that they're indeed not all the same. So the first book I'm going to talk about is Bartimaeus. It's a great book to pass the time, it's easy to read, and if you enjoy it, you'll have 3 books with 600 pages each. So there's a lot of material. And the protagonist, that is another very positive thing about the book, the protagonist is very sarcastic, and if you like that, you'll have a great fun to read it. Though I must admit that the book doesn't have a real deepness. The next one is called Time Machine by H.G. Wells, who is a very famous author, and Time Machine is considered a classic by now. It's a really short book, about 100 pages or so, and it presents a row of very interesting thoughts, especially if you're interested in physics or sociology. But it is not, as they used to say, unputdownable, so you won't probably read it in one sitting. Then we have Genesis. This one is not as well known as Time Machine. It's probably more sci-fi than fantasy. And on the plus side, we have again the shortness, and it's very intense, more intense than Time Machine in my opinion. And it has a very impressive ending, about which I will not lose more words. It's also philosophically interesting, which doesn't mean you have to be philosophically educated to have access to the problem. So there's this part where a robot discusses with a human being about whether a human's life is worth more than a robot's or not. And emotionally, you're on the human side, but you couldn't justify it rationally. And you kind of struggle with yourself because the robot's arguments are so logical, but you just don't want them to be true. So this is a really interesting thing. And then again, you have to say that there's not a broad spectrum of topics encompassed by the novel. Next one are 2 novels. We have The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy and The 13½ Lives of Captain Bluebear. These are 2 novels which are very similar concerning the style. They are both very sarcastic, but on a meta level, not like Bartimaeus, where one of the characters is using sarcasm, but on a meta level. So there are many references in these books, references to reality and to other books, where the author of these novels made fun about a lot of things in a quite subtle way. And if you get these jokes, it becomes a great pleasure reading them. Yet, if you don't, you can just read it like this, and the stories will appeal even to people of younger age. But, on the minus side, since the plot is not even close to what we might call a realistic story, sometimes it's getting too absurd and you just want to put the book away. And then there's my favorite one, The Name of the Wind. Firstly, Patrick Rothfuss is a master of language. The way he plays with it is quite impressive, and it has an incredible deepness. There's so much intentional ambiguity, and while you're reading, sometimes you look up and think, wait a minute, what could this mean? And the main character, I mean, he's such a mystery. You just want to know what's happening inside his head, and sometimes you have the feeling that he himself doesn't know. So there's an extreme psychological deepness. So what's bad about the book? It's maybe not the best book to give to a child, since children won't appreciate the deepness of it and the beauty. And secondly, it should be mentioned that if you are a fan of these typical fantasy cliché action, like dragons and heroes with swords flying through the air. You won't find it here.
Concerning the relevance for reality, I want to show you 3 examples, which I think show that one can indeed relate to fantasy books in day-to-day life. And I guess many will know the books, or at least the movies. And the first one I want to start with is Harry Potter. Harry Potter indeed teaches us many important lessons. And one of them is that friendship comes always first. Friendship doesn't have to be perfect, but you know that your friends will never leave you alone, and that accepting help is not a sign of weakness. Moreover, the main characters show courage, loyalty, and smartness, which makes them great role models, and thus those books are so adequate for kids. Harry Potter also shows that you can overcome your fear, and that the fear of a problem is sometimes much worse than the problem itself. Dumbledore teaches us another important lesson. One time he said, happiness can be found even in the darkest of times, if only one remembers to turn on the light. The next book we want to talk about is The Hunger Games. And there are definitely ancient and contemporary references in The Hunger Games. For example, The Hunger Games, as the games itself, are relating to the gladiators. They were put together into arenas to kill each other, to entertain the richer people who saw this. And that's what's happening in the Hunger Games too. There are also modern trends in the capital, like plastic surgery or reality TV shows, so this can relate to our modern world too. But what is important to mention is that the Hunger Games, the books, do not only show a broken down state, but they also show how poorer states, the districts in this case, are oppressed by the richer and powerful states, the capital. People are exploited, and this is where we can find a relation to our world. Western powers exploit poorer countries. Many workers even die due to the bad circumstances they're working in, because we in our world we expect cheap labor and cheap products. And people know about the circumstances, but it doesn't really get to them because it's just too remote from the day-to-day life. This is also what happens in the book. The people in the capital don't really understand what is really happening. They are simply too fixed to their own little perfect world. Another point is the unique protagonist. Katniss is not a superwoman. She's physically weak due to malnutrition and starvation. She's an underdog, but she wins with agility and starts a revolution and gives hope to all oppressed people in her country. She represents the weaker people who don't want to live under these conditions anymore and who want to fight for what they believe in and for their rights. This shows that even as an underdog, you can start something big, that you can serve a greater aim, and that you should never give up. And the last point to mention about this book is that politics matter. You should always be interested in how your country is ruled, stand up for your convictions, and fight against injustice. The last book we want to present you is Eragon. Eragon shows us that things are not always what they seem. Enemies, for example, are not always what you expect them to be. Sometimes you have to learn that they are not that different from you, and that they've never meant to be your enemy. Concerning the main character, Eragon, we can see that he also has to learn that he won't be perfect from the beginning. He has to try again and again to get better and to achieve his aims. And alongside the story, you can see how Eragon develops to a real hero. He might have started as a little eccentric boy, but in the end, he shows that sometimes you have to think of others first and put aside your own needs to serve a greater aim. If we look at Roran, another main character, we can see that he fights for what he loves. He's just a poor farmer, but he develops to a great leader and a paragon for everybody else. The books also say much about prejudice. For example, creatures who once hated each other work together to fight the same enemy, which means that you can overcome your feelings, your past experience, and learn to work with each other. And last but not least, there are many moral questions in this book. Eragon gets to know many different religions, but he can't decide which one is the right one, or if there is even more than just one. And he also asks himself, if there is a God, why does he let bad things happen? Another moral question is vegetarianism. At some point, Eragon feels so connected to all living beings that he refuses to kill an animal and to eat meat. And the last very important moral question mentioned in the book is murder. Roran has become a famous hero, but to save his own life he had to kill many enemies, and thus he struggles with the question, who is allowed to judge about other people's lives? Who is allowed to end someone's life? How can people determine who is worthy of living longer than others? And shouldn't be everybody and everything be allowed to live?
So I hope we could convince you that fantasy books are definitely not all the same and that they have indeed a relevance for our lives. And in the best case, maybe you've become curious about one of the novels, and if you ever read one of them, or maybe you have already read one, feel free to leave a comment and tell us what you think about them or which one you like best. This is it for today. I hope you enjoyed it. Bye bye.
Bye.